and Social Council on joining forces, effective policy solution, and COVID-19 responses. This briefing has as its framework the recommendation contained in the report of the Secretary General on shared responsibility, global responsibility, responding to the socio-economic impacts of COVID-19, circulated on March 2020. Excellencies, colleagues, and distinguished guests, thank you for joining forces with us this morning to discuss policy solutions for an inclusive and truly human-centric COVID-19 response. Globally, our commitment to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals has not changed, but the urgency to act has. We have an opportunity to plot a multilateral response and to discuss policy solutions that countries can immediately use to combat the COVID-19 pandemic, preserve advances made, and get back on track towards the SDGs. Excellencies, we are developing a better sense of the next steps needed to overcome the health crisis through suppressing transmission, building capacity, and finding a vaccine. At the same time, we are only beginning to realize the true scale of the social and economic crisis that lies ahead of us. Not only of the few problems that this global pandemic has created, including the 1.6 billion workers in the informal economy, nearly half of the global workforce, who are in immediate danger of losing their livelihoods, but also the challenges we thought we were once on track to overcome. Global poverty is set to increase for the first time since 1998, with some regions experiencing poverty levels similar to 30 years ago. Or malaria, where COVID-19 related disruption in programming in sub-Saharan Africa put us at risk of returning to malaria mortality levels from 20 years ago. Or violence against women and girls, which has become a shadow pandemic, with the number of victims increasing to the hundreds of millions worldwide. There are incomprehensible setbacks to our hard-won development goals. These facts are shocking, but they all point to one conclusion. We are facing a new reality post-COVID-19. In dealing with this accelerating and unpredictable change, we must act ourselves. How can we find solid footing in the new, evolving normal? As the Secretary General has highlighted, the creativity of the response must match the unique nature of the crisis, and the magnitude of the response must match its scale. No country will be able to exit this crisis alone. And also in our grief for those we have lost. I express my deepest condolences to the families and countries who have suffered the loss or illness of their loved ones. Colleagues, in each of our countries, we've seen the daily struggles become harder. Not one of us, no family, no community, and no country, big or small, has been spared. And although this virus impacts us all, it has not been an equalizer. It has exposed the inequalities in our societies and compounded them. These disparities should be our catalysts and our call to build back better, with responses on the national level that are shaped by and respect human rights. And global action, which is country-specific, taking into account those in special situations. Now is truly the time to fulfill our promises of leaving no one behind. Colleagues, this pandemic has put a spotlight on the need to strengthen multilateral cooperation, governance, and above all, global solidarity. At the individual level, we show our solidarity by staying at home if we can and helping our communities. At the international level, we show solidarity through multilateralism and working together, drawing on each of our strengths to find a solution for a more resilient future. We must bring expertise together. This is where ecosystem comes into play. At the center of the UN development system, ECOSOC brings people and issues together to promote collective action for a sustainable world. And that is what we are here to do today. ECOSOC has a unique convening power for a range of stakeholders, from member states to our civil society partners and the private sector. This, together with ECOSOC's role to guide and coordinate its ecosystem of entities and specialized agency, leave us ideally placed to plot a multilateral response for the road ahead. One that enables countries to address the immediate health crisis, stem the social and economic impacts, and accelerate our effort to reach the SDGs. Colleagues, we are currently tossing and turning through dangerous water. Fortunately, we have the Sustainable Development Goals as our chart to see us through the storm. There is hope to make this a turning point in the way we do business, to mobilize a coordinated and coherent global response to the pandemic, and halt its adverse social, economic, and financial impact on societies. I hope our discussion here today will be helpful and inspirational to hear the expertise of vital UN agencies and organizations, and to work together to deepen our efforts during this decade of action to recover better and build a healthier, greener, fairer, and more resilient world. A world of solidarity. I thank you. I now invite the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Her Excellency Amina Mohammed, to make a statement. Amina, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency Ambassador Munajul, the President of ECOSOC, Excellencies, dear colleagues. I hope that you can hear me. We've had some difficulty trying to connect. Thank you for organizing this important briefing. More than ever, people and countries everywhere rely on the UN to rise to the challenges of this global pandemic, which is a human crisis. Facing this crisis of such historic magnitude, our collective response must be equally historic, quick, and decisive. Lives and livelihoods everywhere are depending on our ability to better support your governments as they tackle an unprecedented health, humanitarian, and socio-economic crisis. Since the start of the pandemic, we've mobilized the full capacity of the United Nations systems in countries through our 131 country teams to immediately support national authorities in developing public health preparedness and response plans. Recently, the UN Sustainable Development Group launched a UN global framework for the immediate socio-economic response to COVID, complementing the UN health response led by WHO, as well as the humanitarian response detailed in the COVID-19 Global Humanitarian Response Plan. Across our set of responses, we have a clear compass. We remain guided by the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for Development. The Sustainable Development Goals remain center to guiding countries on a sustainable track. As the Secretary General has highlighted, it is in fact the unfinished business in achieving the MDGs and the inadequate, timely investments in our SDG priorities that have made so many countries across every continent so vulnerable to this crisis. In this context, we will need to keep in mind dual imperatives: to respond urgently to stem the impact of the pandemic, while helping governments and people to respond in a way that recovers better, more resilient in the future. Drawing lessons learned from previous crises and leveraging our ability to work effectively together from the UN reform, we have placed all the assets of the UN development system in service of our countries. Our response reflects an integrated and coordinated UN offer under the leadership of a strengthened RC system, the policy expertise from across the system to support governments with difficult trade-offs needed to help sustain progress over time without deepening economic and social instability and environmental degradation. Established new modalities for rapid funding of COVID-19 related programs in countries, and the need for stronger partnerships with international financial institutions, civil society, the private sector, academia, and the scientific community. We're all in this together. Our immediate priority is to address the needs of the most vulnerable countries and communities who risk being left behind. Allocation of our resources will pay close attention to the needs of conflict and disaster-affected countries, least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states. Additional concessional resources for vulnerable countries, a new debt relief program for all forms of debt, as well as a comprehensive and faster mechanism to restructure debt to facilitate economic recovery and SDG achievement in developing countries are going to be critical. Measures to protect and stimulate the economy, from cash transfers to credits and loans, must be targeted at women who make up the majority of those in the hardest hit informal economy and who are at the forefront of the community response. We must also ensure that we include children, people with disabilities, and the elderly. Equal access to information, testing, healthcare, food, and other essential services must be ensured for migrants, internally displaced people, and refugees who are often excluded from social protection measures and risk being detained or deported if they seek support. The needs and rights of Indigenous people must also be upheld, as they already experience significantly higher rates of communicable and non-communicable diseases, lack of access to essential services, and growing food insecurity. This crisis reminds us of the intimate relationship between humans, animals, and the environment. We must urgently address climate change, avoid habitat loss and fragmentation, the reverse of loss of biodiversity, reduce pollution, and improve waste management and infrastructure. Excellencies, colleagues, the UN is leveraging the recent reform efforts to provide you with the integrated, efficient, and transparent support that you have been calling for. Early results show the tangible impacts of UN country teams' joint work in countries. In Ghana, the UNCT reprogrammed existing resources to help tackle health, humanitarian, and socio-economic impacts on COVID-19, with complementary actions taken by various entities under the leadership of the RC. UNDP is supporting the government to measure the impacts of COVID on the economy and leads a UNCT plan to boost livelihoods. UNFPA has established a 24/7 hotline to respond to gender-based violence. WFP is supporting the government in monitoring food prices. UNICEF is leading a partnership to open up testing laboratories at the subnational level, while working with the government to advance payments for over 322,000 households in Ghana. In Nepal, the UNCT is supporting the government to set up 2 call centers to address questions and information on COVID-19 for prevention, attention, and care. The RC has been leading a communications and community engagement strategy with UNICEF and WHO. The UNCT is rolling out messages against rumors and disinformation. In Cameroon, 14 agencies have helped develop a country prevention and response plan to support national priorities in tackling immediate health needs. The UNCT is also working with the government to analyze the impact of the crisis on the local economy, creating a joint basket of funds to boost livelihoods. UN Women engaging religious leaders, women and youth, also providing essential supplies for women in vulnerable communities. UNICEF also working with local authorities to install hand washing stations and provide face masks to vulnerable groups. On the humanitarian response, UN has added another $100 million to its ongoing operations to support COVID-19, which includes training for community health workers in refugee camps. Excellencies, COVID-19 knows no borders, and our response must show borderless solidarity. The Secretary General established the COVID-19 Response and Recovery Fund in early April to catalyze joint action by UNCTs, especially our non-resident agencies, in supporting the most vulnerable countries and communities. I'd like to thank the member states who have stepped up immediately with the initial funding of over $52 million, a large portion of which will be released immediately for over 47 applications that have been made in vulnerable countries. Throughout our response, the guiding reference will remain the 2030 Agenda and its central promise to leave no one behind. You can count on our full commitment to support your governments and ensure that lives are saved, livelihoods are restored, financial resources are mobilized, and the global economy and the people we serve can emerge stronger from this crisis. I thank you very much for having me at this really important meeting. Thank you, Mona.
Thank you so much, Amina, as always, for a very comprehensive and informative statement. This morning, we are joined by a distinguished panel representing the leadership and expertise of the wider United Nations system, who will present and discuss policy solutions that countries can use to combat the COVID-19 pandemic, preserve the advances made, and get back on track towards the SDGs. I'm really very pleased that we will soon hear shortly from our panelists, Dr. Tedros, Director General of the World Health Organization, Dr. Ki Dong-tu, Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organization, Mrs. Michelle Bachelet, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mr. Guy Ryder, Director General of the International Labour Organization, Mr. Mikisa Kitui, Secretary General of UNCTAD, and Mrs. Armida Salisa Ali-Shabana, Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. I'm also glad to welcome Mrs. Anne-Birgitte Albrechtsen, Chief Executive Officer of Plan International, who will serve as a moderator, and I now invite her to conduct the interactive discussion. You have the floor, Anne-Birgitte.
Thank you very much, Mona. It was great to hear your introduction as well as Amina's. I am thrilled and delighted to have this opportunity to moderate this important briefing. And thank you so much for allowing a representative of civil society to moderate today. We know that COVID-19 may not discriminate, but societies, communities, families, people do. And the impact of this crisis will see many different faces because people are different and victims of the crisis are not homogeneous. So as we unpack it together, looking at the impacts on individuals and how policies can make sure that the most vulnerable are the least impacted and not the most impacted, it is something that I will try and help the participants shine a light on, and motivated me as I said yes to this invitation. As we move into the dialogue, I'd like to remind all delegates joining us that through WebEx, you have the opportunity to pose questions to the panelists, and please do that actively. If you press on the screen, you will see that in the third button from the right on the screen that you're looking at, there's a small chat box. And pressing that will allow you onto the Q&A board, which is a great place for you to help me also as a moderator field questions to the panelists. We will start with a dialogue just with the speakers. I will pose them some questions and maybe some follow-up questions based on what they say, and hope to do that as interactively as possible and as personal as possible and engaging, so that this strange new world of WebEx and Zoom and whatever it is that we have spent many months on now can be a lively, engaging space for everybody participating. We have a few time constraints for some of the participants, so I am aware that Dr. Tedros will need to leave us fairly soon after he has answered the first questions. And I'm also aware that Michelle Bachelet will only be joining us in about half an hour, so we will come to her later in the program. With all that said, I've probably said enough to start with. And while I want to hear from every head of agency that's present today, also about their personal realities under COVID-19, given Dr. Tedros's time constraints, I will go to you first. And first, of course, celebrate the efforts that you and WHO have been doing at the time, and invite you to please share with us what are some of the major recent developments that you've seen on COVID-19, and what are your top recommendations right now for everybody listening in terms of making sure that we can leave no one behind, particularly in countries affected by conflict or humanitarian crisis. And then I'd like to add, because that's a question that has come in before the meeting started, where do you see the world moving towards a vaccine? And once it's found, how do we make it accessible to as many as possible? Dr. Tedros, over to you, please.
I think there was a confusion, I will be honest with you. I was asked to speak and I prepared a very brief speech. And as you rightly said, I will be moving into another meeting soon. This is the regular presser. I have only a few minutes. So if you allow me, it would be better for me to read my speech unless you insist in answering. But the vaccine issue, I can say a few words. It's not more than 6 minutes, but with your permission, of course. Sorry about that. Next we will... that was what I knew. Just you make a speech and then you will be okay. So if you agree, I would be happy to do that. With your permission, of course.
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Madam President, Madam Deputy Secretary General, Excellencies, dear colleagues and friends, it's incredible to think that just 19 weeks ago, we knew nothing of this virus. As you know, it's a new virus, and it's the first coronavirus to cause a pandemic, and it has two fatal combinations. One, it's very contagious, and second, it's a killer. That's why it's surprising many countries, by the way. Almost 4 million cases of COVID-19 have now been reported to WHO, and tragically, we have lost almost 275,000 lives. Although cases are declining in Western Europe, they're increasing in Eastern Europe, Africa, Southeast Asia, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Americas. But within regions and within countries, we see divergent trends. That's why all countries need a tailored response. Nonetheless, there are several common things all countries must do, which are outlined in WHO's Strategic Preparedness and Response Plan. First, we call on all countries to mobilize all sectors and communities. Second, to control sporadic cases and clusters, rapidly finding and isolating all cases. Third, to suppress community transmission through infection prevention and control and physical distancing. And fourth, to reduce mortality through appropriate care, especially strengthening or preparing the health system. And fifth, to develop safe and effective vaccines and therapeutics. Research and development are essential for curbing and ending the pandemic. Since January, WHO has been working with thousands of researchers all over the world to accelerate and track vaccine development, from developing animal models to clinical trial designs and everything in between. We have also developed diagnostics that are being used all over the world, and we're coordinating a global trial on safety and efficacy of 4 therapeutics against COVID-19. The world needs these tools, and it needs them fast. past experience has taught us that even when the tools are available, they have not been equally available to all. We cannot allow that to happen. Last month, I joined President Emmanuel Macron, President Ursula von der Leyen, Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and Melinda Gates and others to launch the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, or the SET Accelerator. Last week, leaders from 40 countries came together to pledge 7.4 billion euros for research and development for vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics. This was a powerful and inspiring demonstrations of solidarity, not only a financial support, but of a common commitment to ensure all people enjoy access to all the tools to prevent, detect, and treat COVID-19. The pandemic is teaching us many painful lessons. One of them is about the importance of strong national and subnational health systems at the foundation of global health security and universal health coverage. Strong and resilient health systems are the best defense not only against outbreaks and pandemics, but also against the multiple health threats that people around the world face every day. And yet, on current trends, more than 5 billion people will lack access to essential health services by 2030, including the ability to see a health worker, access to essential medicines, and running water in hospitals. Gaps like this don't just undermine the health of individuals, families, and communities. They also put global security and economic development at risk, as my sister Amina already said. The world spends around US $7.5 trillion on healthcare each year, almost 10% of global GDP. But the best investments are in promoting health and in preventing disease at the primary healthcare level, which will save lives and save money. Prevention is not only better than cure, it's cheaper and the smartest thing to do. The COVID-19 pandemic will eventually recede, but there can be no going back to business as usual. We cannot continue to rush to fund panic, but let preparedness go by wayside. As we work on responding to this pandemic, we must also work to lay the foundations for a healthier, safer, fairer world. And that's how we can say enough is enough and never again. So thank you so much again, and thank you for allowing me to leave. We will be starting the presser in a few minutes, but thank you for your flexibility. And Madam President, Ambassador Mona, thank you so much for your leadership. Thank you again. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tedros. And no worries about reading the statement. We know how busy you are, and it's been great to hear from you. Would you feel like touching on the vaccine issue at all?
Accelerator initiative, already Accelerator initiative, and it's part of my speech, but the original thinking was it may take 12 to 18 months. This was 2 months ago we were saying this, so let's say 10 to 16 months. But the objective of this accelerator is to speed up the development of it, to have it before even this 12 to 18 months period that we proposed. So accelerate the development, and the second objective is to make sure that this vaccine reaches everyone. There is no one to be left behind, and to use it in a very fair way, to distribute it in a very fair way. And that's why we had the fundraising, thanks to EC and others I mentioned, to European Commission. But the funding already raised around close to $8 billion US dollars will not be enough. We need to continue to mobilize in order to accelerate the development, but more importantly, to produce enough so people can have access. And the status in terms of vaccines, we have good candidates now. The top ones are around 7, 8, but we have almost more than 100 candidates, and we're focusing on the few candidates we have and which can bring probably better result and accelerating those candidates with better potential. And we have a consortium of more than 400 scientists that are involved in vaccines, therapeutics, and the diagnostics. And this is what you said, a symbol of solidarity also. When we met in February with the scientists, they agreed to do all they can to speed up the finding of for vaccines, therapeutics, and medicines. But we need to follow up on the accelerator, and not only the research, but at the same time the money will be a bottleneck. So, but I hope with solidarity we will have a good outcome soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tedros, and also for answering that additional question which has come in from the Indonesian mission, both in terms of where we are, but also what are the plans for accelerating the distribution and the administration of the vaccine once it's found. So thank you. I will now move to the rest of the panel, and I really invite the panel to engage as informally as possible, and to maybe start that off. I'd like to do a little lightning round to Chu Dong-yu, Amida, Mukisa, and Guy to tell us a little bit about how you have personally been affected by the crisis. I think what I miss the most is I haven't seen my grandchildren since Christmas, and neither have I seen my parents because they're all in lockdown and we are observing social distancing. How has it impacted you, Chu Dong-yu?
Dear colleagues and the Ambassador Mona and the Deputy Secretary Armenia, and also Madam Brett Singh. Since I always stay in Rome after traveling to Davos. So that was last week of January. And then I was preparing early February how to protect my staff in Rome. You know, it was an epicenter. And we have more than 3,171 employees. That's including staff, consultant, and also internship, and GPA, APA, APO, and so on. So included the family member of those employees, it's more than 10,000. You can see every day I was in February, I was really considering, I was very worried actually, but thanks to my crisis management team we established in the middle of February, and also we have the COVID-15 expert meeting that month. It's more than 1,000 participants from all over the world. It's created also the pressure on me. So being a FLDG, you can imagine, but luckily now I can tell you, all of us, and including family member, are safe. Only one, I'm sorry for that, one senior, he traveled back to Albania in late last week of February, and then he was sick and passed away. We lost one senior, and that's one. Now the Italian situation is it's back to the new normal. We say it's like yesterday. All the data indicate like the first week of March, even better because first week of March we didn't know who is infected or suspended, but now all the the little bit clear picture. Second, all the FAO staff are working very hard with teleworking. Because when I come to the office since last August, I started to prepare digital FAO. And so FAO, we offer several important meetings, big meetings with the Africa Union, all the ministers, with all the UN language translation. So on virtual. And also we fully engage with the G20 and the WEF, EP, EF, and others. So I think it's a way we are now used to the digital visual life.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Also the efficiency. Yeah?
No, thank you. Thank you for sharing. And it's a real challenge to be a leader at this time, obviously. And Guy, over to you in Geneva, I guess, or maybe you're somewhere else.
Guy, how are you, Guy?
No, I'm. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I'm in Geneva, effectively. But moderator, just to answer your question at a personal level, how has this affected me? Well, as others have said, you miss family, don't you? I missed my mother's 92nd birthday. She's in the UK. I wasn't there for that. We've lost one member of our family to the virus, which was very, very sad. But the day-to-day, of course, experience is this, at first quite entertaining, teleworking. You know, the novelty was quite fun for a while. It's worn off on me. I'm really heartily fed up with the teleworking thing. I think it reminds us that in the end, work is a social activity. We really need to meet people and talk to people and have contact with them. So whilst I think we've all learned a lot from teleworking and the capacities of IT technologies, I think we've been reminded of its limitations at the same time as well. And like my colleagues, one of the good impacts of this pandemic is I haven't been on an aeroplane for a very long time. I think the last time I got on an aeroplane was to go to Finland, and there was snow on the ground at the time. So it must have been, I guess, some time ago, although maybe there's still snow on the ground in Finland. I don't know. So it's a mixture of emotions, but, you know, the balance sheet is negative, I'm afraid. I'd like to get back to something like normal, even if it's a new normal.
Thank you so much, Guy, for sharing. Amida, do you want to share with us as well before we get into the business of your agency and how you're helping address the impacts?
Sure, and let me start with the positive angle, of this, the impact, because then we had to start to work from home. Again, you know, just before this work from home modality, we at office, we were envisioning this digital workplace. Okay, so let's plan and that kind of thing, set up the teams, MS teams, everybody go on training, went on training, and that kind of thing. And then, you know, in second, boom, whoosh, we had to work from home because of situation, state emergency. And I think just in a matter of a day or two, everybody adjusted. Initially a little bit difficult, but I think it's quite smooth, And then I think most of my colleagues find out that by work from home, because we are quite ready, all the infrastructure is there. Actually, it increased our productivity, quite significantly. But again, like Guy said, we lost that social networking, interpersonal communication, and so on. But again, same with Guy, we would like to return back to normal, although it's a new normal. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Mukisa, we don't want to lose out on a few reflections from you on the personal front.
Well, first, it has been rather challenging to be indoors for 60 days now, lockdown. Nobody prepares you for that experience. It has been very nice getting to know staff on a personal plane, that you reach out to know how people are doing. We're all learning the new working method, but I still have to find how to deal with challenges of supporting those with mental health challenges through this main medium of communication. It's a humbling experience. We're laid low, a very small creature.
Yeah, sure, and thanks for that. And it is with mixed emotions. I think we all go to work in our lockdown situation and try and meet individuals through very unpersonal means of the video. But at least we have that, and we have this opportunity, wonderful opportunity today to also unpack together what the individual UN agencies represented are doing. Amina gave us a nice high-level overview of that. And as we go through the dialogue today, please also reflect on how perhaps this crisis has brought the UN system closer together. The development system under the One UN reform, across the nexus. There are many questions that have come in from delegations around how collaboration has increased at this time, both within the UN system, but also outside with other actors, and what you are all seeing in that space. So as I go to you, those questions as well, if possible, when you answer it. But I'd like to go back now to you, Chu, in FAO, and FAO has warned policymakers to avoid policy measures that could create a food crisis, stressing that global food stocks are ample and bottlenecks to movement of foods aren't that many. They're actually quite few and limited. But you've also suggested that the pandemic may still affect food demand and supply and cause real issues of malnutrition and even hunger. Can you unpack those two realities of solid global food stocks and then still a crisis that may occur? Over to you.
It's a very good question and important. I think we, so from the early this year, we already faced another crisis, is locust crisis since last December in eastern horn of Africa. So, and then we consider how to deal with that. That there may be partial small locations in the global issues. So when the pandemic came, this crisis, unlike any other one experience, the truly global pandemic combined with a massive worldwide economic shock. It's a shock down. I don't say it's a lockdown, it's a shock down. Nobody believed that they globally shocked down. We saw the two directly impact on food system. That's why we first the food economy has been disrupted by pandemic, and also by necessary measures that has been taken to suppress it. So in many locations I spoke at the G20 summit and WEF and also G20 Agricultural Ministry and with others private sectors. So in many different type of hotspots also, wholesale food market, the slaughterhouse, fish market, you name it. Especially able market, people as they don't go to work, and they go to work and accept the high risk of infection. So as long as the crisis continues, the risk of food system disruption could increase. That's why I didn't say the personal experience you asked. I baked my coffee. I bought several kilos of the raw bean of the coffee, and I baked my coffee and probably being past for 2 months. So that's even more important than high-value commodities of food, vegetables, meat, fish, because the commodities are labor-intensive and also perishable to logistical problems. Second, we are only now beginning to appreciate the true scale and scope of deep economic turned down, brought on by the COVID-19. So I think you mentioned three key areas. First, the supply side. Second is the demand side, and the third is the price. But it's not the simply way from Asia to Europe to America to Africa. No. But if you have very carefully in mind everyone that right now food is available, there is no need to panic. I think stock of cereal, especially stem food, are very good. Almost a double of that there will be in 2007 and 2008, because 2008 it was really shortage, But now we have currently harvest also very good in the south parts of the world, and also early spring harvest. We are going to have a harvest soon next month to winter wheat also. So far, we got also very good data for harvest. But there is the issue of export restriction at the beginning, especially in March. That's why we started worrying. And talk with the private sector also, and all the leaders. I asked the Secretary General also talk with the leaders in most valuable to run the crop calendar, agricultural calendar, and no export restriction. They will increase the price, and they examine the food price volatility. We needed to make sure not to repeat the mistake of the 2007, 2008 food crisis. So that's what action we did in March. Because of the government started to take a trade action to protect their own stock of food, everyone will be wasteful. Fortunately, we have been able to work with the government across the world, and they have been highly responsible. And also look at Asia and East Asia, and also Europe almost over. And we maybe need another 2 weeks more. And there North America, and so you can see all those three parts. It's well logistic food supply chain. So, and also the private sector, bigger food companies and the supermarket. Every week I went to the supermarket in Italy to buy food for my family. But I also wanted to check the price and the supply in the supermarket in Rome. But it's not. But what are we worried? That's why we asked. We had several meetings with the Minister of Africa and the small island standard, as Amelia mentioned earlier. And that's landlocked. Even this morning, I had a meeting with the new Secretary General of the Organization for ACP, Africa, Caribbean, Pacific. It's just really established. So how to have that? Now the only 11 countries still have export restriction, but they represent only 2% of global calorie. Not like 2007.
Mr. Shu, excuse me, I have a little difficulty hearing you. I was wondering if you could move back a little from the microphone. It would be easier. I don't know, but there's a small difficulties in hearing you. Thank you.
But I use my computer. It's fully online. So can you hear me now?
Mr. Chu, it is difficult.
Oh.
So we should thank you for now for shining light on the demand, supply, and price equation in the global food crisis that is evolving as a secondary impact of the health crisis. And allow me to pass over to you, Guy, in Geneva, and I'd like to pose the following question, because according to the ILO, nearly half of the global workforce is at risk as job losses increase. We've heard that, and with women and younger workers most at risk. Can you help us shine a light on how countries can mitigate that particular impact on the world of work, in particularly in those sectors most at risk, and how governments can ensure that their fiscal and financial stimulus measures help protect the most vulnerable jobs and also those in the informal sector? Over to you, Guy.
Well, thanks very much for the question. Let me go straight to the informal economy, which is where I think the most dramatic situation is developing. It's often forgotten that 6 out of 10 workers in the world make their livelihood in the informal economy. Lots of women, high concentration of women. And our estimate is that in the first month of the pandemic, the effect has been lockdowns and everything that goes with lockdowns, is that these people have lost on average 60% of their income, their revenues from work. And these are people who are, not well off in the first instance. So this is a dramatic effect. And clearly, what we have to do is to get immediate support to these people, immediate social protection, direct transfers, cash transfers, food assistance in some cases. And the problem, of course, here is that the informal economy is highly concentrated in those parts of the world and those countries where resources are most scarce and social protection systems are weakest. And in those circumstances, I think there's only one message we can take from the situation, which is we need global solidarity. We need the international cooperation that can get the help to those who are most in need. So that's the informal economy. If I could extend from that, moderator, the loss of jobs in the second quarter of this year, we estimate today to be at the equivalent of the loss of 305 million full-time jobs around the world. You can't count 305 million unemployed, it's more complicated than that. But the loss of working hours amounts to the loss of 305 million full-time jobs. Let me give you the comparison. In 2008, 2009, the immediate hit of the financial crisis then was 22 million. So you can see we're in an entirely different place. Now, it's fair to say that as countries do eventually unlock their economies, these numbers in some cases can come down quite quickly. When Italy goes back to work, France, Switzerland today, those numbers will come down. And yet, I think there are 2 or 3 things we have to think about here. Firstly, how do we help people through the worst of the pandemic and the lockdown? We're arguing for strong support to keep enterprises alive, strong support for job retention, maintaining that linkage between enterprises and workers, even when those people can't go to work. Because if you keep them intact now, when recovery comes and the lockdown ends, they can get back to work that much more quickly. And the other piece of this, of course, is the simple, straightforward safety and health piece. Now, let's not forget that in an average year, pre-pandemic, 2.7 million people in the world die because of the work that they do. Now, our duty of care to working people, and this is particularly important, both for the frontline workers who are working through the pandemic, often women, 70% of frontline workers in health and social care are women. The fatalities amongst these people has been one of the tragedies. They're working heroically, but too many are losing their lives. So I think as we go back to work, we have to make sure that people go back to a safe working place. And there is a lot of anxiety around that. And what we must never do is basically place into conflict the protection of health and the protection of economic and social interests. We must not put people in front of a dilemma where they have to choose between safety and a livelihood. And that's why I think the Secretary General's message, and the Deputy Secretary General really put this to us very clearly at the outset, we have to integrate the health, the social economic responses, and then as we grow out of this problem, getting the right way of getting back on track for the 2030 agenda, as the chair of ECOSOC reminded us at the outset. And these are going to be big challenges. I'm always saying that the new normal that we talk about so much needs to be a better normal. It's the better normal that puts us on track in the next 10 years to reach the 2030 objectives. Thanks.
Can I just ask a follow-on question? As we think about the new normal and building back better, and with all the challenges that you've outlined of particularly the young and women in the informal sector and all the female first responders out there, how would you imagine a response of building back better puts girls, young women at the forefront of such a response? What would you suggest that governments do to stay, sort of to walk the talk?
That's a big question, and you want a short answer, I'm sure. One of the things I think that the pandemic has done has really shone the spotlight on the care economy and the function of care in our societies. We know that those who are professional care workers are amongst the most undervalued workers in the world of work. I hope that we can, keep in mind the fact that we regard these people as heroes today. I hope that won't be forgotten tomorrow. To be provocative, we're giving them a pat on the back today saying, well done. We shouldn't give them a slap in the face tomorrow by saying, just carry on as you were. And women are at the center of the question of reorganizing the care economy. I think this is fundamentally important. And if I might just add one further comment, before the pandemic hit us and the ILO was looking at the future of work during its centenary year last year, seems an eternity ago now, we made the point pre-pandemic that the world was changing with extraordinary pace. We have to deal with the ecological transition. We have to deal with the digital transition. We have to deal with the demographic transition. Those things have not gone away with the pandemic. So when we go to this new normal, we're going to have to take hold of all of these transitions and try to bring them together so that they don't conflict and obstruct each other, but so we can build them into some sort of positive process that can take us forward on all these fronts. That's not easy, but I think it's terribly important. We can't postpone these challenges very much longer.
Thank you so much, and also thanks for answering in brief. So Mukisa, I want to come to you now as we are sitting here in our digital reality, addressing the most critical issue that we may face in our lifetime. We are all privileged to have access to the digital technology that allows us. But of course, millions, billions do not have the same access. And there's a huge digital divide. There's a huge digital gender divide. Could you tell us what you are recommending in terms of how we can help governments accelerate the digital transformation that is so needed in the world?
Well, thank you. First of all, the crisis of the pandemic has very dramatically demonstrated the critical difference of the digital divide. Those who have been able to move into e-learning, e-schooling, who have been able to move, including some developing countries, into virtually cashless transactions, mobile money, and very sophisticated electronic wallets. Those who have been able to offer services, whether it is shipping services, logistics, customs clearance, through single window e-government programs. There is that reality. There is another reality, particularly in the poorer countries, of totally digitally excluded, alienated. Masses who are left behind, where transactions are frozen because of the lockdowns, and a reality of limited options as a way of sustaining a modern economy going. So one of the biggest challenges is basically a more heightened need for addressing the politics of digital inclusion, both in terms of physical infrastructure for broadband inclusion, but also enabling software, the skills necessary, the privacy laws, competition, consumer protection laws and regulations. We as an organization have now helped 25 LDCs to develop diagnostic studies on the state of play in the digital economy and advise policy steps together with the other members of the E-Trade for All initiative, what needs to be done. It's challenging, but it will have to be part of the solution. But we should not just look at the negative side. I think we should also see on the other side the reality that a lot of countries have upped their act. Even those who have been behind have been very innovative in the world, whether it is distant medicine, e-diagnostics, and e-doctor, using drones to deliver blood samples from the countryside in some countries in West Africa. There's there is an innovativeness that has come because of adapting to the challenges of the moment. But most fundamentally, the critical need to close the gap. Also, importantly, to know that digital solutions like e-commerce ultimately will also need physical delivery mechanisms. So building physical logistics for the delivery, for keeping the promise of e-commerce becomes an important component of building that resilience after the crisis.
That. How do you see sort of even from where you sit, how do you see the most vulnerable in communities being part of the successes that you were describing? We know that the digital access is hard, and that infrastructure that you're talking about. Well, but are you seeing some real surges in or best practices in getting the most vulnerable in society onto digital platforms or mobile online mobile systems, etc.? Where can we find real inspiration at this time? You need to be unmuted.
From dramatic enhancement of electronic market visibility of agricultural produce from Rwanda because of the World Electronic Trading Platform inclusion, to the virtual end of cash money in Kenya because of government and operators removing taxation on electronic money transactions. We have some concrete cases that are going on. But I think we should also hasten to put this in context. If you look at the state of the economies of many developing countries before the pandemic started, after a decade of slow recovery from the crisis of 2008, after unkept promises on financing for SDG agenda, after softening of commodity prices for many of them, you see an economic pre-existing condition, which has exacerbated the consequences of the pandemic. So even if you have digital instruments for solutions, the acute financial challenges, acute challenges of debt, the acute challenges of lost revenue because of collapsed exports, the collapse of petroleum industry are so compounded that you cannot see selective solutions that just embrace a technology outside the existing economic challenges of the whole country.
Thank you so much, and obviously you're pointing to the fact that the pre-existing inequalities, whether they're between nations, within nations, or between people, are being compounded and need to be at the forefront of everything that we do. So thank you very much for that. Amida, I want to come to you now to talk, and I hesitate to use the word a perfect storm, but since you cover the Asia Pacific, you're also covering a part of the world that many times of the year get affected by multiple natural disasters, and many of them climate change induced. And we've seen part of the Pacific devastated recently. How do we make sure that the responses to COVID-19 do not detract our attention from the very real needs for investing in addressing the impact of climate change, and make sure that we stay on track for the climate change agenda, the SDG agenda?
Thank you very much, Anne, for the question. Again, our region is so diverse, yeah, including countries, the so-called with special situation, in which the SIDS, the small island developing states, and also other countries in the region, which again affected by climate change induced natural disasters. So, if I may say, by way of numbers, I just quote that, for example, Pacific Island countries is 3 times more at risk in experiencing disaster than the rest of the region. A disaster which is caused or induced by climate change, such as cyclone, a typhoon, and so on. Yes, so therefore, first and foremost, I think very important for these countries to build first and foremost is the resilience at all levels, at the country, of course, at the community level, household community level, country level, sub-region level, which is the Pacific, as well as the broader region, which is the Pacific to the rest of Asia. So part of that, again, I'm not going to repeat, at the household level, the resilience, put people first, such as the social protection, including social assistance. If that is already in place, once the disaster strikes, then government can invoke the system and immediately respond, emergency response, and mitigating the impact of the disaster. But at the country and the sub-regional level, very important to also build this so-called early warning system, to better prepare. I think lessons learned, if household, community, and country are better prepared, so the cost of the disaster can be less, can be mitigated much more, and they can better prepare and also to recover better. And then a second is on the livelihood. Again, countries in that region rely a lot on fisheries, tourism, in which, because of the COVID-19, the impact is significant. Maybe if we see the data, the health-related impact, because they closed down quite early, is not so much. They can mitigate the impact, but then the economic impact is huge. The livelihoods. So no tourism, no more, right? Fishery maybe export, but again, now demand collapse and also very difficult, right, to transport shipment and so on and so forth. So how to mitigate this? And third is, again, looking more at the medium longer term to recover, rebuild better, is related to the climate change. Of course, countries in the particular sub-region Pacific there are the one that are impacted, not the cause, not the source, not so much. So how to again leverage this? Already, but then how to consistently leverage, including raise the ambition of NDC of the other countries, related to the COP and so on and so forth. Why? Because this is very important, including the investment or the mitigation measures related to ocean. Why ocean is important? Because ocean absorb like 20-30% of the CO2. Likewise, how to safeguard, preserve, and also the ecosystem. While we rebuild better, take care of also that aspect. And last, the financing aspect. Financing is also very important, which is the climate finance. How also, in terms of the financing, the countries can access various resources, instruments related to climate finance. Thank you, Anne. Back to you.
Thank you so much for that. I want now to move to Michelle Bachelet, who joined us about 15 minutes ago. It's great to see you. I could see you, Michelle, so I hope that you're still with us. And my question to you before we go to the broader questions from member states that have come in both before the brief and as we've been talking, is that member states have obviously put in phenomenal and extraordinary measures to address COVID-19. and some of them have perhaps had some unintended consequences. What are some of the urgent human rights issues that need to be addressed to protect the most vulnerable at this time?
Hi, Annie, Birgit. Can you listen to me?
Yes, I can.
I'm here.
Yeah, good.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I had another meeting. That's why I came late, but I didn't want to lose this opportunity. The first thing is that, of course, as we all have said many times, that what COVID-19 has shown is the inequalities in our societies. And why I mentioned this, because Mukisa already mentioned that, but it's because this is, even though the virus doesn't discriminate, the impacts do. And it's not, and the people who usually are the most marginalized, the ones who were left behind, are having a bigger impact, a dramatic negative impact with this pandemic as well. So one hand, emergency measures are needed because in particular without a vaccine and without being sure that we can, it pretends to sort of just stop the spreading of the and dissemination of the virus. It has to be, on one hand, proportionate to the evaluated risk, non-discriminatory, and should be enforced humanly, and it has to have a time bound. I mean, for the time that is really needed. If I can say, it has to be used to cope effectively on the pandemic, nothing more, nothing less. So what are the kind of things we need to do to protect? On one hand, identifying which are the most vulnerable. We already know that. We know it's usually people who are the poorest, that have lack of water, sanitation system, etc. And usually there are big families with a lot of children with very bad housing conditions. So this thing like the social distancing and wash frequently your hands doesn't work that much. And many of them in many parts of the world are part of the informal economy, and they have the day-to-day income. So it's very difficult for them, the lockdowns, because it will produce other devastating effects. But of course, we know that people with usually the more vulnerable populations are indigenous people, women, and women not because, I mean, women and men can be equally infected, but the problem is the women in many places are part of the 70% work in the informal economy, so they will have the other consequences as well, and girls. We have seen the duplication or triplication of allegation of violence, intradomestic violence, that the quarantine has exacerbated. And in many places, the other problem is that they have not, they have stopped other services because they are diverting all resources for the COVID-19 response. Of course, LGBTI communities and people living with disabilities and older people. All of those are vulnerable groups. So when countries make their response, and also when in the second phase of their recovery, this needs to be taken into consideration, because otherwise we're gonna continue leaving behind the ones who are already behind. And if you intersect it with migrants and of course with refugees or in places where there are conflict, this is even harder. And the other group that needs to be, and we did some public statement on this, is people in confinement, in conditions that they cannot be in prisons, people deprived of liberty. We see the high levels of lethality in those care homes, even in the US, in the UK, without the protective equipment. So not only the patient, I mean, the old people die, but also many of the workers there. So we need to, and we have been developing guidances on this regard, giving recommendation to member states what to do. One of my concerns is that in many countries, because of and Guy was mentioning that it's a false controversial, is it the economy or the people? Of course, we need to save life, that's the first thing. In some minute, the economy has to be reopened, but I'm concerned that I heard today that in Germany appear new cases, in Wuhan appear new cases, and in South Korea, because they open quickly, and in Singapore and in Japan as well. So it is a very tricky and difficult situation. And because also the recovery will take longer in some places, a lot of companies will probably die, and unemployment levels will be huge. So we will have also the violation of human rights in the second. So we need to think very well how we produce the response and the recovery if we want to not have the most vulnerable, even with the worst possible conditions.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to come back to you, because some of the questions that have come in go straight to the issues of how human rights are being impacted during this time of crisis. So I have about 10 member states that either before the meeting or during the course of the meeting have raised general questions and specific questions. So the Russian Federation has made a strong call for the UN to remove all barriers to humanitarian access. The German delegation and the EU have posed questions around protecting human rights, both the different groups with particular vulnerabilities, but also groups of professions, journalists, civil society, activists, etc. And they would like you, I guess, all to reflect, but that might be specifically back to you, Michelle. As I mentioned in my opening, a number of delegations, Algeria, Japan, the EU, have raised issues relating to UN reform and how the UN reform is unfolding at this stage, and what you can tell us to really demonstrate how different parts of the UN are working together in a different way. A number of the questions that have come in as we've been speaking have gone to this issue of making sure that we're not overlooking pre-existing challenges in countries, deep-rooted poverty and inequality, and the inequality between countries as we look at this. The mission of Indonesia posed the question of how regional institutions are perhaps working differently at this time, and maybe Amida, you can address that from an institutional perspective. There are a number of questions back to you, Guy, in the ILO around social safety nets and what we need to do, and you addressed some of this in your answer. And so those are the types of questions that have come in. So maybe we can do a very quick lightning round to all the participants. If you would not mind trying to focus very specifically on, I know that you're not necessarily humanitarian organizations, but if anybody wants to talk to the issue of humanitarian access, particularly on human rights issues, violations that we may need to call attention to you, Michelle. If everybody can talk to the issue of one UN and UN reform and how a new normal for the UN is emerging, we hope, during this particular situation. Amina talked a little bit about it, but it would be lovely to hear some specific examples of that from all of you. So maybe I can go back to Chu in FAO, and you can answer the specific question that came in from the EU around really looking at how at what this crisis is teaching us about prevention and preparedness in terms of food insecurities.
Okay, and the food security is very important. It's a basic right, human rights, as you said. That's also we are part of the international humanitarian big team. And for food security, just the 21st of February, we released FAO together with other 14 organizations, together with the EU. And it indicated 2019, we already have 175 million suffer from acute food insecurity before pandemic. That was the last year's figure. So now if the economic slowdown, we estimate if the 5% or 10%, there will be created another 50 to 80 million more for the acute insecurity. I mean, that's one. So we have to have a short term to face it and to against. So that's why we encourage all the ministers of agriculture and food to plan it earlier, produce better and more. Second, Also, we have to look ahead for the midterm to have to consider the environmental issues. We will have a meeting with the UNEP together and to launch the UN decade action on the ecosystem restoration. Next year, later this year, we will have UN meetings on the environment and biodiversity. So we wanted to transfer from biodiversity to food diversity, because more and more people live in the city, and by 2050 of this century, we estimate there's 80% who are living in the city. But the food diversity. So we learned from this pandemic or other pandemic or natural disaster, we have to more care on the biodiversity. Third lessons for food insecurity, and we have to produce more with innovation. Innovation, and as you still plan international, I was a plant breeder. So the way to use the modern technology to improve the productivity and less input chemicals, fertilizer, you name it. And their genetic potential. So that's also not matter biotechnology or other new technology. So innovation. And last and not least, I think we also have to change the business model. Some colleagues already mentioned that we need to create the new business model for agri-food system. From production chain, value chain, and supply chain. It should be based on the digital world. That's a new world already there. So after that, the pandemic, I think, speed up, scale up digitalization. In Europe, I came to Rome since last August. I feel there is some came back 10 years ago in China. We already used to the digital e-commerce. You can order everything from all over the world. So I think the next 5 to 10 years, the world will become fully intercontinent by digitalization. So that's, I just gave the lessons, and then we needed more UN development system reform to the country level to offer the tailored service and the tangible results. That's why the FAO, we are willing to work with all the UN sister organizations and the regionals and also country level. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that. And quickly on to you, Guy, and there's a very specific question from Bangladesh that says, what would the ILO do to support governments of countries that have a very large number of workers in the informal sector? So maybe if you can focus on that and also address the EU question, which does relate to the most vulnerable in the informal sector and safety net issues.
Well, thanks very much. Well, I tried to cover a number of these issues when I first spoke, but we are facing a situation, and this relates to the issue of pre-existing challenges that had really never been properly addressed. We have a world of work where only about 1 in 4 workers has anything like comprehensive social protection. So most workers just don't have that, and we can look to the informal economy, but we should look in other places as well. Somewhat surprisingly, think of that gig worker who may be sitting in an apartment quite near the UN building in Manhattan. That gig worker probably has no social protection, no identifiable employer-employee relationship, an uncertain status at work. We see many people at the other end of the labour market, to put it in those terms, who is also lacking social protection. Now, it's all very well to talk about the long-term challenges of extending social protection, and Michelle Bachelet has been a world leader in that fight. We have to keep that very much on the agenda as we move forward. But I think that today's drama is to get immediate assistance to those who simply don't have the means of survival. The question from Bangladesh is interesting because we have a very particular situation in Bangladesh. Nearly 4 million garment workers in Bangladesh, mostly women, whose livelihood depends upon orders received from those retailers who sell their clothes in New York, in Geneva, in the capitals of the industrialized world. Those orders were cut off almost overnight as shops closed down and retailers ceased to operate. And therefore, those 4 million workers were basically left without social protection, without work. We have to think also about how supply chains operate and where the responsibilities need to be fixed along supply chains so that those workers who depend upon buyers who are often very remote from them have some recourse. Could I also take advantage of, you wanted us all, I think, to say something about UN reform, and I won't disappoint you. Look, I think that this situation, this pandemic, is something of a baptism of fire for the UN reform process, because with the excellent leadership of the Secretary General, with his framework of economic and social response, with the fund that has been established to operationalize that framework, we now have to work together. When I say we, I mean all of the entities of the UN system. We have to work together, coherently, and collegiately at the UN country team level, and the ILO is strongly committed to making that happen, so that we deliver to our member states the type of system-wide response which, frankly, they're entitled to expect from the UN system. So it is a bit of a baptism of fire. I think we've set off in a good way to meet that challenge, but we've got a long way to go. We still have to learn, and we still have to make sure that we get the job done well. And if you'll allow me just a last comment on human rights, and again, I hesitate to do this when Michelle is online, but my understanding of the human rights restrictions, I mean, I'm not able to go where I would normally go or do whatever I would normally do. I accept those restrictions on my basic liberties because they seem appropriate, they seem proportionate, and they're going to be temporary. But what, from an ILO perspective, I can say very clearly is I can see absolutely no justification for any infringement or restriction of human rights as they're practiced at work, organizing, negotiating. In fact, quite the contrary, because in these conditions of pandemic, it is more than ever important that governments, employers, and workers cooperate together to get out of this mess. And where they do that and do it well, and there are many examples, the chair of ECOSOC comes from a country where they do it extremely well. Well, it works very well. It brings practical results. This is not theory, this is reality. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Guy. And it allows me also to bring in an issue that was profoundly raised by Marianne Broxton from ATD Fourth World, an NGO that's represented here at ECOSOC today, on how, so one thing is representation and the rights of workers, but the rights of every individual to help shape the new normal, and particularly the rights of the poorest and most vulnerable to be heard, both in terms of how the crisis is impacting them, but also being engaged with government to find that new normal and to set the policy framework as we move ahead. And she would love all of you to also reflect on the participation of the poorest in the policy frameworks. But let me quickly move on and maybe repose the questions that have also come in from the Russian Federation and the Syrian Arab Republic, because they're questions around humanitarian access and global solidarity and ensuring that essential supplies are forthcoming for those impacted by COVID-19, relates very specifically to sanctions and even more specifically to sanctions that have been imposed unilaterally. I don't know whether perhaps you, Makisa, would want to try your hand at an answer to that question, is what is the UN doing in terms of addressing the sanctions that are in place and that are impeding humanitarian assistance from coming forward?
Well, first, the global most significant step that has been taken by the Secretary General on behalf of the UN system was to call for a global ceasefire in areas of major conflict. Now, there are nuanced challenges dealing with interstate conflict and strife, where we cannot easily take a blanket declaration. But of course, it will be very, very good and convenient for all of us in an effort to deal with a global challenge, to reduce conflicts and exclusions, to reduce inhibitions, for example, the movement of medication and best practices in areas with major challenges. This we saw when Iran was among the first countries to face the pandemic, and inhibitions to how it could deal with the challenges had to do with the sanctions that it was facing. So the logical position will be that certain sanctions that come in the way of humanitarian work should be gotten out of the way to facilitate as rapid and effective action as possible, because it is in the interest of everybody that even in sanctioned territories, the pandemic is dealt with effectively.
Thank you very much for that precise and specific answer. I'd like to move to you, Amida, again to reflect on UN reform and how at the regional level the UN is coming together in a different way. It was specifically asked by Indonesia.
Thank you very much, Anne, and also thank you very much for the question. Again, in light of this UN reform, which now comes to the regional level, yes, certainly all agencies, regional commission is doing their activities work is based on their expertise and mandate. Yeah, but then, of course, we understand many of the development challenges of nowadays, even more so, yeah, because of this pandemic, is cross-cutting in nature. So very important, yeah, for all of us to coordinate and work together, yeah, to come up with solution or contribution to the solution. So therefore, in light of this UN reform, especially at the regional level, so we do this through the so-called issue-based coalition. In the case of Asia Pacific, if I may, I just would like to name 2 or 3 of that to include, for example, climate change mitigation and air pollution. That's one topic. Yeah. Second is inclusion and empowerment. Yes, so within each topic, there are agencies that serve as the co-leads, and other agencies become the member. And then we work, yeah, on a certain program activities with concrete, tangible activities, result, time-bound. Yeah, and then we work regional as well as country level. Now, we are better able to do that. Why? Because there is regional commission, which basically work at the regional level, some at national level, and there are the agencies, yeah, that basically mainly work to support at the national level. Yeah, so therefore, we hope, yeah, the intervention, the work would be much more effective. We don't know yet, yeah, because we just started. And then second is, I think this is still our homework, yeah. With again, we see now, yeah, even more with COVID-19, the pandemic, yeah. So what is also needed is actually, yeah, not only the global response, cooperation, collaboration, national response, cooperation, collaboration, but I think, yeah, more and more at the regional and sub-regional level. So this is yeah, the space that I think the role or contribution of UN needs to be further strengthened. Why? Because regional, sub-regional cooperation is very important. Cannot everything at yeah, global is for the commitment and so on, yeah, but then a certain cooperation can be leveraged further at the regional or in some cases maybe at the sub-regional level. And in sub-region, there are sub-regional organizations, yeah, which in some cases are quite strong. Yeah, for example, in the case in our sub-region, we are in Bangkok, Thailand, right? Southeast Asia, ASEAN, yeah, is very strong. And we are of course, fortunate, yeah, UN and ASEAN has already this framework and a very good cooperation. But my point is we need to strengthen and also seize the opportunity, yeah, to leverage further at the regional and sub-regional level, in which the particular agencies, yeah, institution of the UN, in this case, Regional Commission, needs to be further, yeah, leveraged. Thank you, Anne. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and let me pass straight on to Michelle for answering both some of the deeper questions that have come in around human rights abuses, as well as perhaps the question around how do we make sure that the voice of the poorest is part of decision making.
Well, thank you so much. But let me also cover some other issues, because I'm also part of the Interagency Standing Committee on Humanitarian. And there, of course, I did a call as High Commissioner on the 24th of March, a public call to lift sanctions that could mean an obstacle for the response on the COVID. And I've been also in a conversation with the US government on that regard, even though the Treasury clearly states that it should not be applied to any health, medical devices, and so on. And they claim that it's an over-compliance of the banks, but the truth is it's happening. There are obstacles for many countries. And during the informal session of the Human Rights Council that we did like 2 months ago, or a month and a half ago, I also called for member states who felt that the sanctions were affecting them to give us concrete examples so we can provide the information that it could be corrected. On the humanitarian access, the other thing that we were working on is on one of the problems that we have is mobility. Because of the lockdowns, humanitarian actors sometimes cannot get in the time and adequate time to the places they need to live. So they need to negotiate with member states. And we have been asking member states to provide the facilities for the humanitarian actors in the ground to be able to move around, to distribute food or medicines or the test or whatever. And the third thing with the donors that we have been working also is that they provide us with more flexibility on the use of resources, because maybe some resources were given in certain circumstances, but now sometimes need to reprioritize. And I have to say that the majority of donors have been very active with this ask of the Interagency Standing Committee. In terms of human rights violations, it's important to say that, as Guy was mentioning, there are some freedoms that we all accept, the freedom of movement and mobility, the freedom of assembly, because you cannot have big groups, big crowds, and that is dangerous, and that we accept. But there are some human rights that should not be used the excuse of the pandemic. For example, the freedom of expression, the freedom of participation, as you mentioned, of people to be able to be part of the design of the response and on the recovery afterwards even more. What the problem that I feel is that this difficult access to technology makes that in countries where the lockdown is very strong, for people the poorest, they usually don't have digital technology. Sometimes they don't even have telephones, because in some parts of Africa we have provided telephone to the civil society so they can continue being in contact with the people they work on. We also know that it's essential, the community response. So it's clear that if we really want to have policies that has the legitimacy with the people and that are sustainable, that they should include the views of all of the people, but not only the elite, also the poorest and the most vulnerable, because it's very easy to make policies in an office, but you are not living there on the ground. And so it's important that the people on the ground, they really know their problems, they really know that they have the concerns, and that they can be translated. I always said when I was president, look, policies have to adapt to the people, and not the people adapt to the policies, because we need to respond on the realities, and realities are not the same for everyone. The other thing I wanted to mention is the need to, first of all, I'm a medical doctor, and all my life was a big struggle with the finance ministers, that they used to see health as a cost and not as an investment. The same with education in the past. Now I think it's so clear to everyone that it's so important to invest in. And you can invest in primary care systems, of course, that will provide universal coverage of health to everyone. And that is really an investment that is clear and it's important. And I hope in the in the rebuilding, on the building better, this will be a priority because we have seen that even powerful countries will not prepare. The other thing I wanted to mention is that 70% of emergent diseases are zoonosis. It means that they're transmitted from animals and to person, and sometimes wild animals to domestic animals or human transmission. And the problem is that we need to, because you were asking about the environment, we really need to take this seriously in consideration. And I hope we learn the lessons and we understand, first of all, what we have to respect nature. We have to ensure biodiversity, and we have to ensure that the agreements we have done in terms of environment, we really move on. My concern is what is going to happen to Agenda 2030 in the most deprived countries when they have to use all the money on response of COVID. That will need clearly a lot of measures from the international financial institutions, and also, of course, on the support that richer countries can provide to poorest country. And women is a concern, because they too are being impacted disproportionately for the many reasons we already spoken about it. One, UN, well, I think the crisis management thing has been working very well, and we are all in it. And as a matter of fact, we developed a list of indicators, 10 indicators of human rights, and we worked with all the agencies. It was approved with all of them. And when the CEO sent the socio-economic framework, included as an annex the 10 indicators, so there will be work at the country level with the governments, of course, because situations can be different from one country to another, to which are more, in particular, is thought on indicators on the plan on the recovery. So there's lots of things that I could continue. One thing, you mentioned global solidarity. And Birgit, if something has not happened, it's global solidarity. Every country has done it by itself, trying to buy the ventilators, the masks, etc. And it's awful, because if we don't understand that nobody's going to be safe unless everybody else is safe, we're not going to solve this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And that brings us very close to the end. And I will only invite anybody to sort of come in literally with a yes or a no or a final sentence. But there's a particular question from Egypt, which I will call out at this stage, and that is based on this issue of increased solidarity. Collaboration is needed, very new ways of coordinating to get successful action is needed. And the question is specifically in this vein, would effective coordination require something new structures, something permanent that will keep our attention on everything that is being promised, and the policy recommendations and the actions, etc., across sectors, whole of government approaches, whole of world approaches? Is there a need for something new? And with that final question, I actually believe that most of the questions that have been raised, and forgive me, you can blame the moderator if anybody feels that their questions have been overlooked. I think we've been across everything. So a quick 30 seconds last sentence from every panelist, starting with you two. Do we need new structures to hold on to solidarity and coordination? We may have lost FAO. Okay, in the meantime, I'll come back to you if you are there later, but Guy.
Yes, I was having trouble getting unmuted. Look, structures, new things like that, okay, but the absolutely essential starting point is the political will, the reflex to develop the type of common purpose and willingness to cooperate together that can make structures work. Because frankly, we can invent as many structures as we like. It's like having a very expensive motor car. If you don't have petrol to put in the tank, it won't go anywhere. And the fuel that we need now is political will and this sense of global solidarity, as has just been said. That comes first.
Thank you so much, and for your contributions and for the work that ILO does. Mukisa, please.
There's a component that was not quite addressed in this discussion, which is the ballooning challenge of debt in the developing countries, which is getting in the way of national emergency action, both to mitigate the pandemic, but also for economic recovery. And here I would just say two quick sentences. One, there is a need for a new global debt deal, which has three distinct components. One is to build on the automatic standstill on debt, the moratorium on debt, which is a breathing space for countries to mobilize resources, both to reduce the economic pain, but also to attend to the medical emergency, but also that it has to be so comprehensive that no creditor is allowed to take any enforcement action taking advantage of the suspension of multilateral and bilateral debt. The second component is enhanced relief and restructuring of debt. And the third component is a new international developing country debt authority, which will help to structure a sustainable way of dealing with debt after the pandemic without sacrificing the gains of sustainable development goals.
Thank you, and thank you for at this stage bringing in the issue of debt, which also goes to a number of the questions that have come in around not overlooking the pre-existing challenges of many countries, which obviously is the debt burden. Amida, new structures or new political will?
Regardless, of the situation. Again, whether there's pandemic or no pandemic, again, very clear, technology, ICT, that's the future in any segment of our economy, life, and so on. So that's one. Second is the new generation, not so much only youth, but again, if we look, the so-called the millennials, the generation Z, which they have this a little bit different traits. They are very natural with technology. So actually we need to focus on them. Also solution, also policy, need to focus on them. So they need also to feed into the solution. And last is the emerging countries also. Countries all over the world, there are leaders. There are certain countries leaders in technology, leaders, and even in the response, right? In this COVID-19, there are few countries. Why some countries are doing much better and things like that? Why in the ICT technology? Why in the poverty reduction and so on? So countries can learn from each other. So can we, UN also foster this more cooperation also across countries. Okay, thank you. Back to you.
Thank you very much, and over to Michelle before we go back to the president of ECSOC.
Birgit, I think, guys club, I think it's not a problem of structure. It is a problem of political will and a problem of leadership. And I have felt there is not a strong leadership worldwide that really could have convene all the, the UN has tried to do their best. And I think Secretary has been very active, and all of us trying to bring all our expertise. But I think it's an issue of political will. And I think it means because we need multilateralism more than ever. And but it looks like there are some structural factors that have done that some countries have not so pro-multilateral. And finally, something I cannot not mention is that from the 12 more successful countries on the response, 7 are led by women. And they have been showing that they can have very decisive action, a very action-oriented plan, but on the other hand, very compassionate and very close to the peoples and very transparent and speaking the truth to the people. And they have had very good results. So I also hope that in the better back building, it also means that the world will recognize not only the women health workers, that the majority are women, and applaud them at 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock, but also understand the contribution that women give to the world and to the pandemic as well. Thank you, Birgit. You're muted. You're muted. You're muted.
I'm back again. Thanks, Michelle. I believe that our colleague from FAO is now back online. So my question really was a very short one, and we have to finish. Do we need new structures or more political will?
Yes, and we need a flat structure and a strong political willingness and commitment to the food system and the environment. And the last sentence, I think the multilateralism and understand the basic human being. We are human being, no matter I'm a geneticist. So we have to treat any non-discrimination to any people, any location, and any culture. That's, I think, a pandemic lessons we have to share. And the solution is innovation. Innovation of the business model, innovation of the infrastructure, innovation of the technology itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that brings us to the end of the dialogue, which calls for a renewed global collaboration, solidarity, and leadership. A frame does exist with the Economic and Social Council for sharing, for collaborating, for building political momentum. So, Ambassador Yule, back to you.
Thank you so much, Birgit, for really making this into as much of an interactive dialogue as I think is possible under these virtual circumstances. I'm really pleased, both by you, but not least the panelists, for leaving their notes behind and speaking freely and answering the very pertinent questions from the moderator. So thank you so much. I'm really happy that we managed that well. It's all due to you. So thank you. And I now then invite USG Liu Chemin from DESA. Liu, you have the floor for closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you. You can hear me now? Madam President of ECOSOC, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I'm pleased to join you this morning. I would like to commend the President of ECOSOC for organizing this important informal briefing. I'm grateful for the critical messages from our distinguished colleagues of UN system agencies and from the insightful dialogue. As we have heard today, the COVID-19 pandemic is a human crisis of historic magnitude, resulting in global economic, financial, and social crisis. The pandemic has destabilized global economic growth, leading us into a major global recession that threatens the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. According to the 2020 SDG Progress Report, which will be released soon, between 40 to 60 million people are likely to be pushed back into extreme poverty as a result of the COVID-19. The first increase of poverty population in 3 decades. The lack of domestic financial resources, high debt levels, and fragile health systems present an urgent challenge for many countries. The crisis may well have far-reaching impacts on education, employment, food security, and sustainable development in the long term. It may also have a long-lasting impact on migration and the attitude towards foreigners and migrants. Pre-existing inequalities along various dimensions appear to aggravate the vulnerability of people to the pandemic and its impacts. At the international level, the crisis threatens to hit especially hard the LDCs, LLDCs, and SEEDs, who are already experiencing the social and economic effects. It can have potentially devastating impacts on health and livelihoods in the months to come. As the Secretary General Antonio Guterres has underscored, we, the UN system, must support the health response, mitigate the socio-economic impact, and use the recovery to build back better, anchored in the 2030 agenda and leaving no one behind. The first line of response has been at the national and the local level. Those are the critical interventions. But the world can only succeed in controlling the pandemic and its impacts through a coordinated multilateral response, solidarity with the poorest and most vulnerable countries and people. We must remain guided by the 2030 agenda and the Paris Agreement on climate change. The crisis laid bare the weakness of our health, social protection, and other systems. We must address those shortcomings and build the kind of institutions, policies, and economy that will put us on track towards realizing the SDGs for all people. We must build on the experiences we learned through this crisis, such as on the use of information technology to accelerate progress during the decade of action and delivery of sustainable development. Our response must be inclusive, reaching everyone, and turn the tide against inequality. Acting through the multilateral system, we can respond to disparities across countries. The Secretary General has launched various initiatives and called for a global stimulus package of historical size. I urge all countries to follow suit. The UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs has been supporting the Secretary General and informing the international response to the crisis through its analysis and assessment and through its support to intergovernmental work. You, the member states, face this crisis, I wish to assure you that you have the full support of the United Nations and my department. Together, let us respond to this pandemic and move to the path towards the sustainable future of peace, prosperity, and dignity for all, and a healthy planet. Thank you, Madam President. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Youth Really. I then think I will just sum up this very fruitful meeting by just once again thanking the speakers, the moderator, and also for those who took part, watching, listening in, and participating with your questions. I hope everyone will be able to take away something useful from this briefing today, and things to consider both for national actions and for our ongoing efforts here at the UN. I would once again thank you for joining. Have a good day, stay safe, and I declare this informal meeting of the ECOSOC Joining Forces Effective Policy Solution of COVID-19 Response for concluded. Thank you.